Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, right after the end of the spring semester and in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Since we do not yet know for sure what format our classes will take in the fall, and since there's some likelihood that at least some of us, both students and faculty, will have to be away from campus for a time should the mitigation plans prove ineffective, or should compliance with or enforcement of public health guidelines prove impossible, I am preparing a video version of each of my lectures for the class to have it ready if and when it is needed. It's also the case that necessary distancing requirements in the classrooms may make it impossible that the entire class can be in the same room at the same time. In that case, those whose turn it is to stay away from campus may find these video lectures a better option than relying on a live classroom feed via Zoom or some other technology. So if you're watching this video, it means that we are, for reasons of public and personal health, still unable to meet together in a traditional face-to-face classroom format. All the same, I'll continue to do my best to teach you what I know with whatever tools I have at my disposal. Enjoy the lecture. So now that we've finished the second quiz, we move on to deductive reasoning, and we will spend the rest of the semester looking at different forms of deductive reasoning, especially focusing first on syllogisms. But before we get to syllogisms, there are a few things about deductive reasoning that we want to be sure we cover. First of all, deductive reasoning is reasoning based on logical form. So a deductive argument is an argument that moves or proceeds to a certain or logically necessary conclusion. And arguments which are deductive leave no doubt because they reason according to a strict logical form. That is, we call them formal arguments because they follow a particular logical form. So when we speak of logical form, we mean that the assertions or the statements which make up the argument relate to each other in a specific way. That is, they relate to each other according to the rules of inference for that particular form. And so one of the things we're going to do as we go forward is to learn to recognize and to construct arguments according to each of the logical deductive forms, and especially to learn the rules of inference related to those logical forms so that we will be able to assess or test whether an argument is valid or not. So when we talk about rules of inference, here's what we mean. Each form, that is, each form of deductive reasoning, has rules of inference which will allow us to determine if the argument is valid or not. So the rules of inference allow us to construct a valid argument, and they allow us to analyze and test arguments to see if those arguments are valid. So we need to learn rules of inference for each of the forms. And again, the first form we'll deal with is the syllogism. So we'll be learning first the rules of inference related to syllogisms. So when we test the validity of an argument, we're testing whether the argument follows the rules of inference for one of the logical deductive forms, whether that's syllogisms or conditional arguments or disjunctive arguments. We're looking at whether or not that argument is constructed according to the rules of inference. If it is, it would be a valid argument. If it's not, it would be an invalid argument. So deductive arguments have form, which is to say that we're concerned with how the parts of the argument relate to one another, more so than what the particular substance or content of the argument is. And all of these forms lead us to a logically necessary conclusion. That is, if the form is constructed according to the rules of inference, and if all the assertions or statements in the argument are true, it is inescapable that the conclusion is true. So if we take the two premises as true and the argument is constructed according to the rules of inference, we must accept the conclusion as true. It's logically necessary. So this is different from some of the argument, or most of the argument forms that we learned earlier, because those practical forms of reasoning were based on degrees of probability. So, for example, you think about arguments by analogy or argument by sign, right? And in those cases, we made a judgment that it was likely the claim was true based on the evidence, but it was a degree of probability. With deductive reasoning based on rules of inference, if the rules of inference are followed, there isn't any doubt. That is, we can be certain about the truth of the conclusion because it's a logically necessary conclusion. It's a conclusion derived from the proper construction of the deductive form. So we'll be able to test any of these arguments because we know the rules of inference for each of the forms, and we know how to apply those rules of inference to any particular example of a syllogism, a conditional argument, or a disjunctive argument. So let's go back and review. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the semester, but let's go back and review and put deductive reasoning into the context of some of those earlier discussions that we had about how we think about things going on in the real world. So remember, we talked about terms, statements, and arguments. And our first sort of operation of the mind is that of understanding and determining whether the terms that are used in a statement, whether those terms are clear or not, right? So before we can get into testing whether the argument is valid, we first have to know what are the terms that are used, what are the terms that represent the different categories in the argument, and are those terms clear? Do we understand what each of the terms refers to, and is there agreement between the arguer and his or her audience about the meaning of those terms? So that first operation is that of understanding, asking the question, are those terms clear? Then we see that terms are combined into statements, and we'll be dealing with statements mainly in this first lesson. But after we agree about the meaning of the terms, that is, after we understand the terms or the terms are clear, we then see the terms combined into two-term statements, subject terms and predicate terms, and then we would make a judgment about whether those statements are true or false. So we understand the terms. Now the terms are combined in a statement, and we shift to a judgment or judging about whether the statement is true or false. Remember, a statement is a sentence or a part of a sentence that can be true or false. So we're talking about statements as logical units here. And so after we understand that the terms are clear, we want to know also that the statements are true. And then we move to the combination of statements within a deductive form. So we look at whether or not the statements are put together according to the rules of inference, and we reason about that deductive form to determine whether the argument is valid or invalid. So that's the essential judgment or assessment that we're making about any deductive argument. We want to be able to answer the question, is the argument valid? Which is to say, does the argument follow the rules of inference for that deductive form? And so we would say of any deductive argument that it's either rational or irrational, the inferences are warranted or unwarranted, but in a deductive argument, the rational arguments, the warranted arguments, we call valid arguments, because not only do they end up in a true conclusion, but they have a form that follows the rules of inference. So let's take a step back and consider what we call two-term statements. Now, remember, statements are sentences or parts of sentences that can be true or false. And we're concerned here with the way sentences are constructed with subjects and predicate terms. So when we talk about a two-term statement, we're talking about statements made up of two terms, a subject term and a predicate term, remembering that each of the terms, the subject term and the predicate term, represents a class or a category of people, things, ideas, objects in the real world, right? So if we understand what the term means, we also understand what that class or category is that's represented by the term. And when that term is used in a statement, it is combined with another term representing another class or category. And so the statement expresses something about the relationship between those two classes or categories using the subject term and the predicate term. And so we would make a judgment then about whether that two-term statement was true or false. But at this point, just focus on the fact that a two-term statement is a statement made up of two terms, a subject term and a predicate term. And each term represents something in the real world, a category of things, people, objects, places, ideas, principles, feelings, right? Each term represents a different class or category of things. Subject terms represent the object or the category which the statement is about. So when you have a statement, the subject term gives us the class or category that we want to say something about, right? That's the subject term of the two-term statement. And the predicate term represents that class or category of objects, things, ideas, people, etc., that tells us something about the subject term. That is, it relates to the subject term in a certain way. It tells us that what we know of the predicate term is or is not true of all or some of the subject term category. So there's a relationship or an overlapping between the subject term category and the predicate term category. So the subject term is the term that represents what the statement is about, and the predicate term is the term that represents the category that tells us something about the subject term. So all of this happens in what we call the universe of discourse. And the idea of the universe of discourse is simply a way of thinking more practically or more efficiently about all of the different categories or classes of things that you want to refer to with the terms in your statements and then ultimately also with the terms in your whole argument. So what do we mean by the universe of discourse? When we name a class or category using a term, each term actually divides the universe into two classes or categories. So each term has what we call a complement, and each class, which is represented by the term, has also then a complementary class. So we think about the term, and there's one explicit term in the statement. Let's say we're talking about the subject term. That subject term gives us an explicit term that represents a class or category, but also implicitly there exists what we call the complementary class. That is, an additional class that together with the subject term class makes up the whole universe, or together with the class or category that's represented by the predicate term represents the whole universe. So we call that complementary term or the complementary class that together with the term we're using makes up the whole universe. This will become clearer in a moment as we go forward here. So together, the class and its complementary class, or the term and its complement, make up the universe of discourse. So here's the concept of the natural universe. Think of the natural universe as everything that exists and has ever existed, right? So this is the natural universe. But when you invoke certain terms in an argument, there's no need to be thinking about everything in the natural universe. It's perfectly reasonable and much more efficient to reduce the size of your universe, if you will, to just those things that are concerned with what you're arguing about. So in other words, just those things that are named by your subject and your predicate term, and by implication, the complementary classes of your subject term and your predicate term. So when we talk about the universe of discourse, then let's take, for example, UNH students. When I use that as my term, let's say I use this as a subject term in a statement, UNH students, I'm talking about a specific class or category of people. In this case, people who pay tuition and enroll in classes at the University of New Hampshire. But when I use that term, right, UNH students, I haven't talked yet about the whole universe, and certainly not even the whole universe of discourse, because implied in the use of that term, UNH students, there is also a complementary term that refers to a complementary class. And that complementary term, or the complementary class, we would refer to as non-UNH students. So thinking about this in terms of the natural universe, the class of UNH students would be the same, that it would contain those people who are enrolled and pay tuition at the University of New Hampshire. And then the class or category, the complementary class or category of non-UNH students would be everything else in the natural universe. But of course, if you're engaged in an argument about UNH students, or UNH students is one of the terms in your argument, there's no need to be talking about everything else in the natural universe, trees, planets, quasars, political ideologies, all of those other kinds of things, right, that exist in the universe, but which aren't relevant to your argument. So we reduce the natural universe to just a universe of discourse that contains the terms we are using and their complementary terms. So when we talk about UNH students, we know that term refers to the people who enroll and pay tuition at the University of New Hampshire. And within the universe of discourse, when we're talking about non-UNH students, we're talking about other people, in other words. In other words, people who are not students, people who are not paying tuition or not enrolled in classes at the University of New Hampshire. And we're only concerned with the people who are either UNH students or non-UNH students. We don't need to think about groundhogs and cars and whales and oceans and everything else in the natural universe. So here's a two-term statement that combines our subject term, UNH students, with a predicate term, beer drinkers. So let's go back to our operations of mind. We look at this statement and we want to ask first, are the terms clear? Do we know what we mean by UNH students? Do we agree that beer drinkers refers to a class or category of people who consume an alcoholic beverage made from malt, water, yeast, and hops? Okay? So once we have a clear understanding of what the terms mean, then we've essentially defined our universe of discourse. Not the natural universe, right? But we're talking about classes or categories of people. We have UNH students and also by implication non-UNH students. And then we have beer drinkers and then also by implication non-beer drinkers. So we have those four categories or classes of people. UNH students and its complementary class, beer drinkers and its complementary class. And together, those four categories make up the universe of discourse for this two-term statement. So here it is in a Venn diagram. Now, maybe you can remember doing Venn diagrams in 7th grade algebra, but they are helpful as displays of logical relationships between classes or categories of things. So if we take this category of beer drinkers and this category of UNH students within a universe of discourse, we see how these categories overlap. The statement says some UNH students are beer drinkers, which is in effect to say some members of the class or category of UNH students are also in the class or category of people who are beer drinkers. But then also represented here in the big blue circle, right, is the universe of discourse. That is, those people who are non-UNH students and those people who are non-beer drinkers. And so that would be a visual, Venn diagram display, in effect, of the universe of discourse for this two-term statement. So each two-term statement has what we call a quality, and each two-term statement also has a quantity. So with the quality, two-term statements can be either affirmative or negative. And when we talk about an affirmative statement, we say an affirmative statement is a statement that affirms a class inclusion. In other words, it says members of one class or category, represented by a term, are included as members of another class or category. So that example that we just saw, right? UNH students are some UNH students are beer drinkers. That affirms a class inclusion. It says there are members of the class or category of UNH students who are also in the class or category of people who drink beer. And then there are negative statements. And negative statements deny a class inclusion, which is to say, negative statements tell us that members of one category or class, represented by a term, are not included as members of another category or class represented by a term, right? So we look at those statements that deny a class inclusion. Those are negative statements. And together, affirmative and negative are the possible qualities of a two-term statement. So any two-term statement must have a quality, which is to say any two-term statement is either affirmative or negative. And then two-term statements also have a quantity. And the quantity indicates to us how many of the category overlap, right? So in universal statements, what we're saying is that every member of the subject term class is included in the predicate term class or is not included, because it could be affirmative or negative. But in other words, in a universal statement, the statement is about every member of the subject term class. Either they are all included or none of them are included, right? But the statement, whether it affirms or denies a class inclusion, in a universal statement, the statement is made about every member of the subject term class. And then there are particular statements. And particular statements are statements that are about just some members of the subject term class. And by some, we mean at least one. It could possibly be all, but we don't have enough information. If there's at least one, we use the term some to indicate a particular statement. And so particular statements are statements about some members of the subject term class. It says, in other words, and our example was a particular affirmative, a particular statement says, some members of the subject term class are also included as members of the predicate term class. That would be a particular affirmative. In other words, some UNH students are beer drinkers, but you could also have a particular negative statement, which would say, for instance, some UNH students are not beer drinkers. So the particular negative said some members of the subject term class are not included in the predicate term class. So the key thing here from this slide is the recognition that every two-term statement has an identifiable quality and an identifiable quantity. And our first step in analyzing syllogisms is to be able to identify the quality and quantity of each of the statements that make up that deductive argument. And so, in fact, your first exercise in this unit of the class will be translations from natural language into what we call standard logical form. And that will mean being able to recognize in a natural language statement, and by natural language I simply mean the language that we would use in everyday conversation, not strict logical language, but being able to translate, recognize in natural language what the statement is saying, that is, what the statement is expressing about a categorical relationship, and that includes being able to understand and to analyze what is the quality and the quantity of each of those statements, right? So every two-term statement has a quality, affirmative or negative, and a quantity, universal or particular. And this will become clearer, I think, as we go through some of the examples in a few moments. So we just talked about standard logical form. And when we refer to standard logical form, we're talking about the accepted way by which we express the logical relationship or the categorical relationship between the classes or categories represented by the subject and predicate term in a two-term statement. And because we know there are quality and a quantity for each two-term statement, there's a specific way that we have to express that relationship so it properly represents the nature of the categorical relationship, whether it is universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, or particular negative. So you don't have options here. If you want to do it correctly, you must use standard logical form to express that categorical relationship. So each two-term statement then expresses a categorical relationship between the subject term class and the predicate term class. And so because we know there's two quantities and two qualities, that is, there's affirmative and negative statements and universal and particular statements, that gives us four possible ways to express the relationship in a two-term statement. So these four ways of expressing that categorical relationship are what we call the standard logical forms for two-term statements. So again, when we get to that first homework exercise, the homework exercise will ask you to read a sentence in natural language and then translate that sentence into standard logical form so it can be a statement used in a deductive argument. And you'll be using one of these four forms for every one of the examples on the first homework assignment. So every natural language statement then can be translated into standard logical form. Remember, we're talking about statements, which is sentences or part of sentences that can be true and false. So we're not talking about sentences that are in the form of a question, for instance. So it has to be able to be a statement. But once we see a statement, we can translate that natural language statement into standard logical form using one of those four standard forms, depending on what we analyze to be the two-term statements quantity and quality. So these are the standard logical forms. The first we'll talk about is universal affirmative. And a universal affirmative statement affirms a class inclusion of every member of the subject term class. Then there's the universal negative, and a universal negative denies a class inclusion of every member of the subject term class. There is then the particular affirmative, and a particular affirmative affirms a class inclusion of some members of the subject term class, and then a particular negative denies a class inclusion of some members of the subject term class. So just by way of review, when we talk about a universal affirmative, we're saying every member of the subject term class is included in the predicate term class. And when we say universal negative, right, we're saying each member of, or no members of the subject term class, no members of the subject term class are included in the predicate term class, because it's a universal denial of inclusion. And then we have particular affirmative. So we're saying, in effect, some members of the subject term class are also included in the predicate term class. And when we have a particular negative, we say some members of the subject term class are not included in the predicate term class. So here's the way then that we express that in standard logical form. For a universal affirmative, we always use this form. Universal affirmative is expressed as all subject terms are predicate terms, right? And you can use the abbreviation UA for universal affirmative. In other words, all members of the subject term class, fill in the blank, are members of the predicate term class, fill in the blank. But the universal affirmative is always expressed as all are. And then the universal negative. The standard logical form for universal negative statements is no are. You can use the abbreviation UN to represent universal negative, but it's always expressed as no members of the subject term class are included in the predicate term class. So here I would caution you, be careful not to fall into the trap of using all are not. Because if you say all are not, it's logically ambiguous. Does it mean none are, or that some are and some are not, right? So to avoid that ambiguity, the only correct standard logical form for a universal negative, and the one that you always have to use to express that relationship between the categories, is no are. That is, no members of the subject term class are included in the predicate term class. Then we have particular affirmative. And the standard logical form for particular affirmative, abbreviated as PA, the standard logical form for particular affirmative statements is always some members of the subject term class are in the predicate term class. And then similarly with the particular negative, abbreviated as PN, the standard logical form is always some fill in the blank are not fill in the blank. In other words, some members of the subject term class are not included in the predicate term class. So this is what you're trying to use as your standard logical form as you read natural language arguments and translate them into standard form. You determine what kind of a statement it is, universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, or particular negative, and then translate it into standard form using the appropriate form from this list, right? Natural language will come in all varieties, but there's only one standard logical form for each of the categorical relationships that you are trying to express. So all of your answers, in other words, on the next homework assignment, all of your answers will be in one of these standard logical forms. All you've got to do is figure out what's the subject term, what's the predicate term, is it a universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative, or you could ask, is it universal or particular, and then does it affirm or deny a class inclusion? Then you have all the information you need to just plug in or fill in the appropriate form to construct the statement in standard logical form. So here's some examples. Here's a universal affirmative statement. All whales are mammals, right? So we see this again, and sometimes the visual helps you to imagine what the categorical relationship is. We have the category of mammals here represented in yellow, and then we have the category of whales, and we note that the entire category of whales is included in the larger category of mammals. because it's a universal affirmative. It's a statement that says every member of the subject term class, which is whales, is included in the predicate term class, which is mammals. Another way to think about it is there aren't any whales who are not mammals, right? So all whales are mammals is a universal affirmative statement, which is to say all members of the category or class of whales are included in the class or category of mammals. Then we have a universal negative, right? No U.S. presidents are communists. So here we have the class or category of U.S. presidents, and we also know that the predicate term class is communists, but where will that be represented? There's obviously a larger group of communists than there are the number of people who have been president of the United States, but still the same, these are mutually exclusive categories, because in a universal negative statement, there's no overlap between the two categories. And so the universal negative statement says, in effect, no member of the subject term class, in this case U.S. presidents, are included in the predicate term class, which is the class or category of communists. Then we have particular affirmative. So here's an example. Some athletes are professionals. Notice that it's some, right? So it's particular, and it says are, which tells us it's affirmative. In other words, some members of the class of athletes are included in the class or category of professionals. So we have the class or category of athletes and the class or category of professionals, and we see that the categories overlap. It doesn't include every member of the subject term class athletes, neither does it include every member of the predicate term class professionals, but there is some overlap because the statement tells us it's a particular affirmative. It says some members of the class or category of athletes are also included in the class or category of professionals. So we're talking about this group in the middle that overlaps in the Venn diagram. Those are the some athletes who are also in the class or category of professionals. And then we have particular negative statements. So here's an example. Some students are not homeowners, which is to say there are people in the class, or at least one person in the class or category of students, who are not also in the class or category of homeowners. We don't know exactly how many. We know there's at least one because it's particular. And in this case, we're denying a class inclusion of that particular, right? However many there are in that group. We're saying some are not. Some members of the class or category of students are not in the class or category of homeowners. So here's the category of students, and here's the category of homeowners. But where are the students we're talking about? We're talking about the some who are not homeowners. In other words, we're talking about those who are outside the homeowners circle here. We're talking about those who are non-homeowners. So yes, it's possible that there is some overlap, that there might be some students who are in the class or category, but we don't know that from the statement. All we know from the statement is that there are some students who are not homeowners. We don't know how many exactly, but we know there's at least one. And so we would represent that visually this way, and we have then our particular negative. So here's some examples for you to practice testing. Here's a natural language statement, and the objective here is to translate into standard logical form. So this will be very much like the exercise, the homework exercise. However, I have to say, on the homework exercise, there are some deliberately tricky ones. There are ones that really require you to think and analyze carefully. They're meant to be tricky and hard to do, so don't be discouraged if you find there are a few that aren't easy to do. These examples, I think, will be much easier. So we have example number 1. A few of the guests were brave enough to try the new horseradish dip with their parsnips, right? So as you look at that, there are some clues here. We see that we have a few of the guests, the subject term being guests, right? And it's a few, and that tells us this statement is particular. And then we also see the verb to be, were. That is, that's affirming a class inclusion. It says that we're talking about the guests who were in the category, that is, who are included in the predicate term category of people brave enough to try the new horseradish dip with their parsnips, right? So that's a long description of the predicate term class, but nevertheless, and you can abbreviate if you want, but it's nevertheless the class or category that is the predicate term class in this statement. So now we have the information we need. We know it's particular, and we know it's affirmative. We know what the subject term class is, and we know what the predicate term class is. And so we should be able to generate a statement in standard logical form, thereby translating this natural language statement into standard logical form. So we would ask, what's the subject term? And in this case, it's guests. And then what's the predicate term? That is, people brave enough to try the new dip, right? What's the quality of the statement? We said it's an affirmative statement because it affirms a class inclusion. It says members of the subject term class are included in the predicate term class. And then what's the quantity of the statement? We know it's particular because it's a few, right? Not all, but a few. And that means there's at least one, maybe 2, 3, 10, however many there were, but some. It's particular. And so now all of that information taken together gives us that particular affirmative statement now in standard logical form, right? Guests, predicate term, quality, quantity. Some guests are people brave enough to try the dip, right? That's the statement in standard logical form. And here's how it would look visually. People who tried the dip, guests, and which guests are we talking about? The guests in the overlap section. Some guests are people brave enough to try the dip. Here's another example. Again, natural language. Nobody at the office had heard that the boss had been fired by the general manager. Now you could imagine saying this to somebody in a conversation. That's what we mean by natural language. But this is not in standard logical form. And our objective is to translate it into standard logical form so it could be used, for instance, in a syllogism down the road. So in this case, we look at this and we see all of the parts of the statement, but let's analyze it. What's the subject term? What is the predicate term? What's the quality of the statement? What's the quantity of the statement? So the subject term, right? People at the office. What's the predicate term? People who heard the boss had been fired. What's the quality of the statement? It seems to be negative. Nobody, right? That's a negative term, had heard. Nobody, in other words, in the subject term class or category is included in the predicate term class. And the quantity is also signaled by the word nobody. It's universal. That is, there's no member of the class or category of people at the office, no member of that class heard that the boss had been fired. That is, no member of the subject term is a member of the predicate term class. So we would translate it as no people at the office are employees who heard the boss had been fired. Now notice what I did if we go back to the universal statement, the natural language statement here. I've added a noun to the predicate term. And the reason I do that is it reminds us of the concreteness of the predicate term category, that the predicate term is made up of objects, ideas, people, things in the real world, right? And the noun helps us to keep that in mind. It reminds us of the categorical or class representation of the term. So I've plugged in the noun here, employees, to go along with the noun and the subject term, people. It helps us also envision the universe of discourse for this statement. So no people at the office are employees who heard the boss had been fired. This is the only way to construct a universal negative with the terms no, are, right? No subject term, are predicate term. No people in the subject term category are people in the predicate term category. And here's how we would represent this visually. So we have people at the office or office workers and employees who heard about the firing, and there is no overlap because no members of the subject term class are included in the predicate term class, and that's the universal negative. So here's a third example. Everyone who passed the class received the authentic certificate from the legitimate authorities. Now there's a good clue here, right? But again, what we're asking is, what is the subject term? What is the predicate term? What is the quality of the statement? What is the quantity of the statement? So the subject term is people who passed the class, right? And the predicate term is those people who receive the authentic certificate from the legitimate authorities. So what kind of relationship is expressed between those two categories represented by those two terms, right? First of all, what is the quality? Does it affirm or deny a class inclusion? In this case, it seems to affirm. It says there are members of the subject term class who are in the predicate term class. Those who passed the class did get the certificate. So it's an affirmative statement. And then what about its quantity? Note the word everyone, right? That's universal. So it's a universal affirmative statement. So it would appear in standard logical form as in abbreviated form, all class passers, or in other words, people who pass the class, are students who receive the authentic certificate from the legitimate authorities. Or in other words, all class passers are certificate recipients. This would be that natural language statement in standard logical form. Subject term, predicate term, quality, and quantity. So here's how you would represent it visually. We have certificate recipients, and where do you predict the class passers will be? Fully inside the category of certificate recipients, because the statement tells us all class passers are certificate recipients. Here's example 4. There are those among the immigrants who were not able to secure a work permit, right? So again, ask the questions. What is the subject term? What is the predicate term? What is the quality? And what is the quantity of the statement, right? So the subject term, those among the immigrants, or we could just say immigrants, right? Subject term is immigrants. And the predicate term, people who were able to get a work permit, right? People with a work permit. But what is the quality here? The quality, we look closely, we see the word not, right? And not tells us this is a negative statement. In other words, it's a statement that denies a class inclusion. And then the question is, does it deny that class inclusion for every member of the subject term class or just some? And in this case, the language tells us it's particular. There are those among, that's not universal, but it's particular. In other words, some immigrants are not able to secure a work permit. So we see this in standard logical form. It looks like this. Some immigrants are not work permit holders. Again, you can abbreviate the predicate terms if they're longer or the subject terms if they're longer, but just make it clear what terms refer to what categories and are the terms in the right place. So in this case, again, you notice we add in the noun holders just to give us a sense of concrete or physical category or class that the term represents. And here's how we would represent it visually. We have immigrants and we have permit holders, and at least implicitly there may be some immigrants who do hold permits, but we're not talking about the ones who do. All the statement tells us about is those who are not permit holders. So we're talking about these immigrants outside of the class or category of permit holders. And that's the particular negative statement. Here's another example. About half the non-resident students attending the retreat were undecided about their academic major. About half the non-resident students attending the retreat were undecided about their academic major. Now you notice what I've done here, and this makes it a little bit more challenging, is you have to think also not just about the subject and the predicate term, but also about their complements. And so here what I've actually done is use the complementary terms to construct the natural language statement, right? About half the non-resident students attending the retreat were undecided about their academic major. So what's the subject term? The subject term here is non-resident students. Of course, the complement would be resident students. So the subject term is non-resident students. The predicate term is people undecided about their academic major. And then what's the quality? Does it affirm or deny a class inclusion? In this case, non-resident students attending the retreat were in the category of people undecided. So it's affirmative, right? So we have an affirmative statement. And then what's the quantity? Is it talking about all or just some? Well, it says about half, so that's less than all. It's a particular statement. So it would be particular affirmative, and in standard logical form, some non-resident students are undecided retreat participants. So in this case, we make sure we retain the reference to the complement non-resident students. We don't have to change the quality of the statement. We just use the subject term and the predicate term as they appear in the natural language statement, and we make sure we pay attention to whether the statement affirms or denies a class inclusion between those terms that are represented in the statement. So non-resident students and undecided retreat participants remain in the statement. Those are the categories we're looking at the relationship between, and in this case, we are affirming a class inclusion of some members of the subject term class. So visually it would look like this. We have non-resident students and undecided retreat participants, and we're talking about the students in that overlap category there, right? That some members of the class of non-resident students are also in the category of undecided retreat participants. Example 6, 3 of the designated drivers were not, in fact, non-drinkers. So again, a little bit tricky, and I'm trying to do that on purpose to challenge you a little bit here, right? But you, again, can figure this out by applying the same standard 4 questions. What is the subject term? What is the predicate term? What is the quality? And what is the quantity of the statement? So the subject term is designated drivers. The predicate term is non-drinkers. The quality of the statement, in this case, we see were not, and that tells us it's a negative statement, right? So it denies a class inclusion. And what is the quantity? 3 of implies that there is more than 3, okay? So it's some, so it would be a particular negative. And the particular negative would be represented in standard logical form as some designated drivers are not non-drinkers. Okay? Again, we maintain that complementary reference in with the term in the with the predicate term, and we also retain the quality of the statement as denying a class inclusion, and just express based on what we have in the natural language. And that would be expressed visually this way. We have the category of designated drivers and the category of non-drinkers. And of course, we're talking about those outside of the class of non-drinkers, because we're saying some designated drivers are not non-drinkers, right? So we're referring to those who are outside the class or the circle of non-drinkers, a particular negative statement. So that's the introduction to two-term statements in standard logical form, and you will be asked on your next homework exercise to do precisely the same thing we've just done in these 6 examples, which is to translate from natural language into standard logical form, identifying correctly the subject term, the predicate term, the quality, and the quantity of each of the statements. And if you have any questions on this lecture or on the homework exercise, please post them to the discussion board.